A wealthy business owner unjustly fires a black employee after discovering she is pregnant with his child. Years later, the woman's son secures a job at the same company, unknowingly working under his estranged father. The wealthy man is stunned when he hears the young man's last name, forcing a confrontation with the past he tried to leave behind. Amara Grant sat before Richard Collins's desk, her hands folded nervously in her lap. The leather seat felt cold, as if it wasn't meant for her. Richard continued to scan the documents on his desk without looking up. The faint scratching of his pen was the only noise, heightening her anxiety. At last, putting down his pen, Richard reclined in his chair and gazed at her with the same calculating look she had seen so many times before. "Amara," he said, his tone steady but aloof. "I take it this isn't a work matter." Amara's heart raced. She had played this conversation over and over in her mind for days, but now, sitting in front of him, the words seemed caught in her throat. She swallowed and made herself speak. "No, it's not," she murmured, her gaze dropping to her hands. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard remained still, showing no reaction, as if he hadn't heard. He didn't seem to have heard her. Before he eventually spoke, the seconds passed slowly, each one getting heavier than the one before it. "I see." That was all he said. Amara blinked, her heart pounding. "It's yours, Richard," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought you should know." Richard sighed and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk as he clasped his fingers together. "Amara," he started, his tone calm and detached. "This is unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Her voice shook, disbelief creeping in. She'd braced herself for anger or shock, but not this cold indifference. "Yes," Richard replied, meeting her gaze with a frosty expression. "You should have been more careful." Her stomach churned. We were careful." "Clearly not careful enough," he said, his tone slicing through her like ice. He leaned back again, his eyes narrowing. "And now you're telling me because you expect me to do what exactly?" Amara's throat tightened. She hadn't planned for this. She didn't anticipate this situation, or that he would be so aloof. "I thought you'd want to know," she murmured. "I thought we could work something out." Richard's expression grew steely. "Work something out, Amara? You know the rules. I'm married. I have a family, a reputation. This," he said, gesturing between them, "was never meant to be more than it was." The words struck her like a physical blow. Now she knew that she had been a fool. Steeled moments, whispered promises, late evenings in his office. It had always been something disposable to him, but she had allowed herself to think it was something real. Amara straightened in her seat, mustering her last ounce of courage. "I'm keeping the baby, Richard." He exhaled sharply, rising from his desk to stand in front of her. "I can't be a part of this, Amara. You know that. This conversation, it didn't happen. Understood?" Her blood froze. "What? You're just going to walk away?" "I have to," he said, his tone steady but resolute. "And so should you." Amara rose, anger igniting in her chest. "I can't just walk away from this, Richard. It's your child, too." Richard's jaw clenched. "Amara, consider this a warning. Let it go. I've looked after you, but if you cause trouble, I'll make sure you regret it." Her heart sank. "What do you mean?" He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he returned to his desk, his face a mask of cold indifference. "I'm saying today is your last day at Collins Associates." Amara went still. "What?" "You'll be let go quietly. HR has already been informed," he said, his tone clinical and detached. "You'll receive a severance package, but after today, your employment here is over." The word struck her like a slap. "You're firing me because I'm pregnant? Because of you? I'm safeguarding my family, Amara. You should do the same." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold warning. "If you come after me, I'll ensure you're blacklisted from this industry. Amara's hands trembled as fury clashed with disbelief within her. She stared at the man she once trusted, now regarding her as if she were a threat. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she said, "I never thought you'd stoop this low." "You shouldn't have expected anything else," Richard said, his tone as calm as if discussing a routine business matter. Amara's eyes stung with unshed tears, but she forced them back. She wouldn't cry in front of him, wouldn't give him that power. Without a word, she turned on her heel and left his office. Her legs moved on autopilot as she made her way to her desk. Her hands worked mechanically, every item she packed into her bag feeling heavier than the last. In the elevator, she stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, struggling to hold herself together. But inside, she was falling apart. Her career, her future, gone in a matter of minutes. Now she was alone, pregnant, unemployed, and blacklisted from the field she had fought to succeed in. The tears spilled over as she stepped out onto the street. She felt unseen, just another anonymous face in the crowd. No one would ever know the truth. Richard Collins had ensured it. As she walked away from the building that had once held her dreams, she rested a hand on her stomach, where new life was growing. She wasn't truly alone. She had her child, and somehow they would make it. Sunlight streamed through the blinds in Tyrell's bedroom, creating long shadows across the floor. He stood before the mirror, straightening his tie for the 5th time. It was his first day at Collins Associates, and his nerves crackled like static beneath his skin. Looking sharp, he said quietly, trying to boost his confidence while squaring his shoulders. The whistle of boiling water from the kitchen broke the quiet. Tyrell could hear his mother bustling about as she prepared for her day. He smiled faintly, imagining how proud she'd be when he returned with tales of his first day. Checking his phone, he saw 5 minutes left before he had to leave. It was time to get his mom's blessing for the day. Entering the kitchen, he saw Amara sitting at the small round table, cradling a mug in her hands. She glanced up as he entered, offering a faint smile that didn't fully reach her eyes. "Mom, how do I look?" Tyrell asked with a grin, spinning to showcase his suit. "First day at Collins Associates. This is huge, right?" Amara gave a slow nod, her grip on the mug tightening. "Yeah, Tyrell, it's big." Tyrell froze mid-step, unsettled by something in her tone. The excitement he'd anticipated wasn't there. Instead, worry clouded her face. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "You don't seem as excited as I thought you'd be." Amara's eyes fell to the steam curling from her tea, avoiding his gaze. "I am happy for you. I don't know about that place." Tyrell frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's Collins Associates, one of the biggest insurance firms in the country. This could be huge. For me, for us." "I know, baby," she said gently, her voice nearly a whisper. "But that place, it's not what you think." He stared at her, confusion etched across his features. "What do you mean? Did you know someone there? Is that why you're worried?" Amara's grip on the mug tightened, her knuckles turning pale. Her lips thinned, and for a moment, it seemed she might say more, but she shook her head instead, her focus still on the tea. "It's nothing like that. I just want you to be careful, that's all." Tyrell leaned back, struggling to understand her abrupt shift in mood. His mom had always been his strongest advocate, urging him to aim high and believe he could achieve anything with hard work. But now, as he was about to embark on something big, she seemed hesitant. "Careful?" he echoed, frustration creeping into his tone. "Mom, this is what we've been working toward for years. I didn't go through all those years of school and internships for nothing. This job could change everything for us." "I know," she said, finally meeting his gaze, her eyes clouded with something like fear. "But not everything is as it seems." Tyrell leaned forward, frowning. "What's going on, Mom? Why are you saying this now? You were happy when I first told you about this job." Amara hesitated, and the tension between them seemed to deepen. It felt like an unspoken weight hung over their conversation. What had changed was beyond his comprehension. I just don't want you to get hurt," she finally whispered. "Some places have shadows, Tyrell. Things you don't notice until it's too late." Tyrell's frown grew deeper. "Shadows? Mom, it's a job, an opportunity. I'm not some kid walking into a trap. This is going to help us. Help you." Amara's shoulders sagged, and for a moment she looked older than he'd ever seen her. "Just promise me you'll be careful, Tyrell." His frustration eased as he noticed the heavy burden she seemed to carry, though he couldn't understand it. "I'll be careful, I promise. But you have to trust me. I've worked too hard for this to let anything ruin it." She nodded, though the concern lingered in her expression. "I trust you, Tyrell. I always have." He stood, glancing at his watch. "I've got to go. I'll call you later, okay?" Amara smiled faintly, though it seemed to take effort. "Good luck, sweetheart." Tyrell kissed her forehead, then grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. Before stepping out, he glanced back. She still sat at the table, her gaze fixed on her tea, her face tight with unease. A flicker of doubt surfaced, but he pushed it aside. This was his moment, and he wouldn't let anything derail it. The subway ride to Midtown felt like the start of something monumental. Tyrell stood in the packed car, holding the pole tightly, his mind whirling. This was what he had worked toward, the first step to success, and he wouldn't let his mother's odd warning cloud his thoughts. Collins Associates was one of the most prominent names in the field. They didn't hire just anyone, and he'd outperformed hundreds of applicants to land this job. If his mom was uneasy, it was likely just nerves. After all, it was a big step, and maybe she was afraid of what it might mean for their future. He'd talk to her about it later, once she wasn't so shaken. As he exited the subway station, Tyrell stopped in front of the towering Collins Associates building. The sleek glass tower rose above him, imposing and formidable. Sunlight bounced off its reflective surface, making it glimmer like something from a dream. He inhaled deeply and straightened his posture. "This is it," he thought. "This is the beginning of everything." Inside, the lobby was vast, humming with the quiet activity of professionals rushing to their destinations. Tyrell checked in at reception and was soon escorted upstairs by his supervisor, Miss Robinson, a sharp-eyed, fast-paced woman who brooked no nonsense. "Welcome to the team, Tyrell," she said as they entered the elevator. "We're expecting great things from you." "Thank you, ma'am," Tyrell responded, his nerves giving way to excitement. "I'm eager to begin." Miss Robinson nodded curtly. "Good. Let's see if you meet expectations." They navigated the office, a labyrinth of cubicles and transparent meeting rooms. The office was pristine and cutting-edge. Staff remained busy and focused, sparing only brief glances as Tyrell walked by. The air was charged with intensity, an unspoken pressure to excel. As they continued, Tyrell saw him, Richard Collins, the CEO, deep in conversation with senior executives. Tyrell couldn't suppress a rush of admiration. This was the man who had created the company from scratch, someone who symbolized everything Tyrell aspired to be. Yet as they passed, Richard's eyes flickered in his direction. Their gazes locked momentarily, and Tyrell stiffened. Richard's expression didn't shift, remaining neutral and professional. Yet in his eyes there was a fleeting glimmer of recognition, like a shadow flitting across his face, and then it vanished. Richard resumed his discussion without a second look. Tyrell shrugged off the odd sensation and moved on. It was likely his imagination. Richard Collins couldn't know him. He was just another fresh recruit. Yet the look lingered, nagging at him as Miss Robinson led him to his desk and outlined his initial tasks. As the day progressed, Tyrell concentrated on his tasks, the excitement of a new beginning overpowering his lingering unease. This was his place, and he was determined to prove his worth. Yet, despite immersing himself in his duties, his mother's warning echoed in his mind. Some places have shadows, Tyrell. Things you don't notice until it's too late. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. He wasn't in harm's way. He was here to succeed. Whatever shadows haunted his mother's thoughts, they wouldn't reach him. Not here, not now. By mid-morning, the office hummed with a steady rhythm of keyboards clicking and soft conversations. Tyrell worked at his new desk, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard as he got acquainted with the workflow. Miss Robinson had assigned him a pile of documents to review. While the work was manageable, the gravity of the workplace bore down on him. Collins Associates was intense, with everyone around him appearing laser-focused. Yet no matter how much he tried to focus, his thoughts returned to that fleeting moment in the hallway when Richard Collins's gaze met his. That brief glimmer of recognition. Tyrell frowned as he flipped through the pages of the report before him. It didn't add up. Richard Collins didn't know him. He couldn't know him. He was simply another new hire in a massive company with hundreds, perhaps thousands of employees. Why would the CEO pay him any attention? He brushed the thought away. It was likely just first-day nerves. Tyrell had a habit of overthinking, especially when high stakes were involved. He needed to stay focused, prove his worth, and demonstrate to the higher-ups that he belonged. Lunch passed quickly. Tyrell ate hurriedly at his desk, unwilling to waste a moment. He'd heard Collins Associates was a cutthroat environment where productivity was everything, and he wasn't about to lag behind. The reports were complex, but he worked through them diligently, intent on leaving a strong impression. Yet as the afternoon dragged on, the odd feeling from before crept back into his mind. It wasn't just the way Richard Collins had looked at him. There was something more, something elusive beneath the surface. The unease returned later when Miss Robinson stopped by to review his progress. "You're doing well, Tyrell," she remarked, peering over his shoulder at the screen. "Good pace." "Thank you," Tyrell said, leaning back to stretch. "Just trying to stay on top of it all. You're doing just fine. Keep at it." She began to walk off but paused, her expression shifting to something more serious. "Oh, and one more thing. Mr. Collins wants to see you in his office now." Tyrell blinked in surprise. "Mr. Collins?" "Yes." She offered no further explanation. "He's on the 40th floor. Go on up." Miss Robinson departed without another word, leaving Tyrell frozen at his desk, stunned. Why would Richard Collins want to meet him, especially on his first day? His heart raced as he rose and adjusted his jacket. This couldn't be normal, could it? New employees didn't just get called up to the CEO's office out of the blue. He scanned the office, but his co-workers remained absorbed in their tasks, oblivious to him. Tyrell headed to the elevator, his palms clammy. He focused on calming his breathing. This could be positive, couldn't it? Maybe something in his resume had impressed Richard, something that caught his eye. Maybe this was a personal welcome to the company. Yet, even as he attempted to reassure himself, a quiet, uneasy voice in his mind suggested otherwise. His mother's earlier words came back to him. Some places have shadows. When the elevator doors slid open on the 40th floor, Tyrell stepped into a completely different world from the bustling lower levels. The executive floor exuded a hushed elegance with expansive windows bathing the space in soft afternoon light. Everything here radiated importance, from the sleek furnishings to the plush carpeting. He approached the receptionist's desk, ignoring the growing knot in his stomach. "I'm here to see Mr. Collins. Tyrell Grant." The receptionist, poised with a warm smile, nodded and motioned toward the imposing wooden doors behind her. "He's expecting you. You can go right in." Tyrell paused briefly, his nerves buzzing. Taking a steadying breath, he pushed open the doors and entered Richard Collins's office. The office was enormous, offering a sweeping view of the city skyline that made Tyrell feel even smaller. Richard sat behind a grand mahogany desk, his back to the window, scanning a stack of papers. Richard didn't look up right away, and for a moment Tyrell stood motionless, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, Richard raised his head, his face unreadable. "Tyrell, come in. Take a seat." Tyrell walked across the room and settled into the leather chair across from the desk, his heart pounding. Richard Collins's aura was imposing, amplified by the stillness of the room. "So," Richard started, his tone calm but deliberate. "How's your first day so far?" Tyrell swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "Good, sir. I've been reviewing the reports Miss Robinson assigned. Everything's going smoothly." Richard nodded and placed the papers down, his gaze sharpening as he studied Tyrell more intently. "Good to hear." A brief silence followed. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Tyrell. There was an odd intensity to his gaze, as though he were trying to identify something. Tyrell felt the air in the room grow heavy with tension. "Was there something specific you wanted to discuss, Mr. Collins?" Richard's expression remained neutral. "You're new here, Tyrell, just starting, but your name stood out to me." Tyrell's chest constricted. "My name?" "Yes." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly before he leaned in. "Grant, correct?" Tyrell gave a slow nod, unsure of what was coming next. "Yes, sir. Tyrell Grant." Richard's eyes lingered on him a moment longer before he leaned back, his face blank. "It's a strong name. Reminds me of someone I knew once." Tyrell's heart pounded in his chest. Now the weight of Richard's words seemed to press on him. Could Richard know? Could he have somehow pieced it together in this short exchange? But Richard didn't pursue it further. Instead, he gave a faint professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I like to stay informed about new talent joining the team. We're expecting a lot from you, Tyrell. Keep up the good work." Tyrell nodded stiffly, unsure how else to respond. "Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you." Richard shifted his focus back to the papers on his desk, effectively ending the conversation. "Good. You can return to your work." Tyrell rose, his legs shaky as he walked to the door. Just as he touched the handle, Richard's voice halted him. "Oh, Tyrell." Tyrell turned back, his hand frozen on the doorknob. "If you ever need anything," Richard said, his voice calm but tinged with something Tyrell couldn't quite place. "My door is always open." Tyrell nodded once more, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'll remember that." With that, he stepped out, his heart still pounding in his chest. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Tyrell in the silent hallway, grappling with what had just transpired. There was no logical reason for Richard Collins to show interest in him, especially to summon him on his first day. Still, the way Richard had looked at him, the mention of his name, it felt like more than a coincidence. The elevator ride back to his floor felt far longer than it should have as Tyrell made his way back to his desk. The office's ambient noise surrounded him but failed to ease the knot of unease in his stomach. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Something was off about this place, and Tyrell couldn't shake the sense that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The key turned in the lock as Tyrell pushed the apartment door open. The familiar smell of home greeted him. Amara's cooking mingled with the faint lavender scent she used to clean. The warmth of home almost succeeded in melting away the strange tension that had clung to him since leaving Collins Associates. Almost. He placed his briefcase carefully by the door and loosened his tie as he headed into the living room. Amara sat on the couch, a book resting open on her lap, though her gaze was fixed elsewhere. She looked up at his arrival, her face unreadable. "How was it?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with an emotion Tyrell couldn't identify. Tyrell hesitated, unsure how to sum up his day. The thrill of starting fresh mixed with the unsettling sensation of being seen, of being known. Richard Collins's gaze, that fleeting flicker of recognition. The day had been a confusing mix of excitement and unease. "It was fine," Tyrell said, attempting to sound confident as he sat on the couch beside her. "Busy. They've given me a lot of reports to go through, just trying to get a sense of the place." Amara nodded, though her eyes lingered on him a bit too long. She didn't seem convinced. "Anything out of the ordinary happen?" Tyrell hesitated, debating how much to share. "Not really," he started, then stopped. There was no use hiding it. His mom already seemed uneasy about the job. "Actually, I met Richard Collins today." Amara's grip on her book tightened. You met him? Tyrell nodded. Yeah. He asked to see me in his office. I don't know why. It was strange. I mean, he's the CEO. Why would he care about a new employee? Amara said nothing, her expression darkening as she averted her eyes. Tyrell noticed the sudden tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened when Richard's name came up. She wasn't reacting the way he'd expected. Something else was happening. He leaned closer, his tone gentler. Mom, what's going on? Why are you acting this way? Amara's breath hitched. She placed her book carefully on the coffee table, her hands trembling as she clasped them together in her lap. Tyrell, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago. Tyrell frowned, his stomach tightening. What do you mean? She closed her eyes briefly, taking a steadying breath. Richard Collins. He's not just your boss. Tyrell's pulse raced, a chill of confusion sweeping over him. What? What are you saying? Amara's gaze locked with his, her eyes brimming with regret and sorrow. He's your father, Tyrell. For a moment, the words didn't register. Tyrell blinked, his mind scrambling to grasp what she had just revealed. His father, Richard Collins. The Richard Collins. What? Tyrell whispered, his voice faint. That can't be true. Amara nodded slowly, her voice trembling but resolute. It's true. Richard and we were involved a long time ago, before you were born. Tyrell shook his head as disbelief washed over him. But you always said my father left. You never told me who he was. He rose abruptly, running a hand through his hair as his thoughts spiraled. How could you hide this from me? How could you not tell me? Amara stood as well, wringing her hands nervously. I was trying to protect you, Tyrell. I didn't want you to grow up knowing the kind of man he really is. What kind of man? Tyrell's voice climbed, charged with anger and disbelief. You didn't think I deserved to know? To know who my father is? Tears glistened in Amara's eyes, but she held his gaze. I didn't want you to get hurt. Richard, he didn't want you. When I told him I was pregnant, he fired me. He severed all ties, and when I tried finding work elsewhere, he blacklisted me from the entire industry. Tyrell froze as her words sank in. He blacklisted you? Amara nodded and wiped away a tear. Yes. I couldn't find work after that. No income, no support. It was just me and you, and I had to fight to survive. He didn't care. He just wanted me gone and did everything to ensure I couldn't return. Tyrell's stomach churned. The man he had respected, the man he'd just met today, his father, had done this. He had left his mother with nothing and abandoned him before he was even born. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Tyrell asked, his voice lower now but still laced with hurt. All these years I wondered about him. I asked you, but you never told me. Why now? Amara's face fell and she sank onto the couch, her hands shaking. I thought I could bury it. I didn't want you to know the kind of man he is. But when you said you'd gotten a job at Collins Associates, I couldn't hide it anymore. You deserve the truth, Tyrell. I just didn't know how to say it. Tyrell stood frozen, staring at her, his chest constricting with a tangle of emotions, anger, confusion, and sorrow. For years he had been left in the dark, and now it was all coming apart before him. A wave of nausea crept over him. Richard Collins, his father, had known about him all along, and not only had he abandoned them, but he had deliberately ruined his mother's career. I can't believe this, Tyrell muttered, shaking his head. I've been working for him, sitting in his office like just another employee, and he's known all along. He doesn't know who you are, Amara said softly, her voice barely audible. He didn't recognize you, Tyrell. He doesn't know. That's not the point. Tyrell's voice broke, anger flaring within him. He abandoned us, Mom. He ruined your life, and now I'm supposed to work for him like nothing ever happened. Amara looked up at him with pleading eyes. I didn't tell you this to make you hate him. I told you because I didn't want you walking into that place blind. I didn't want you getting close to him just to be hurt again. Tyrell's chest rose and fell rapidly as he struggled to breathe. Everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. All his life, he'd thought of his father as a mystery, a man who had simply left. But the reality was far worse. He began pacing the room, dragging his hands over his face. I don't even know what to do. Should I confront him? Should I quit? Amara stood and rested a hand lightly on his arm. That's your decision, Tyrell, but think carefully. Richard is powerful. He could destroy you the way he destroyed me. Tyrell locked eyes with her, the anger still simmering inside him. I'm not scared of him. He can't hurt me the way he hurt you. Amara exhaled deeply, her expression heavy with worry. I just want you to be safe. Tyrell looked at her, the weight of everything overwhelming him. He wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was certain. He couldn't continue working for Richard Collins as if nothing had changed. He couldn't keep acting like the man who had abandoned him and ruined his mother's life was just another CEO. I'll figure it out, he said at last, his voice strained. But I can't keep working there, not anymore. Amara nodded, her expression growing gentler. Whatever you choose, Tyrell, I'll support you. Tyrell drew a deep breath, trying to quiet the storm raging within. Everything had shifted in just a matter of minutes. The job he once thought was his big break now felt like a cruel betrayal, and the man he had admired, his father, was a stranger, a man who had done more harm than Tyrell had ever imagined. Sitting down beside his mother again, Tyrell felt the truth's weight seep into his very bones. The life he'd known was gone, and now he had to figure out what to do with the pieces left behind. The subway rumbled beneath Tyrell's feet as he gazed out the window, his reflection flickering in the darkened tunnels. 2 days had passed since his mother had revealed the truth to him. 2 days since everything he had believed about his life had been upended. He still couldn't fully process it. Richard Collins was his father. Tyrell's hands curled into fists as the reality sank in further. Each time he replayed the conversation in his mind, it only fueled his anger further. His father, the man he'd encountered on his first day at Collins Associates, had seen him as just another employee. The man who had wrecked his mother's career, blacklisted her and abandoned them without hesitation. And now Tyrell was working for him as though none of it had occurred. The subway screeched to a stop, pulling Tyrell out of his thoughts. He needed to collect himself before stepping into the office. He couldn't let anyone notice how close he was to breaking, not just yet, not until he decided what to do next. The chilly morning air greeted him as he exited the station and stepped onto Midtown's bustling streets. The sleek glass tower of Collins Associates loomed ahead, stretching upward into the sky. It had once symbolized success to him, a place where he believed he could prove his worth. Now it felt like a prison, ensnaring him in a twisted game he hadn't realized he was part of. The office buzzed with its usual activity as Tyrell stepped inside. Phones chimed, voices murmured, and the constant tapping of keyboards filled the space. No one paid him much mind as he moved toward his desk, which suited him perfectly. He needed a moment to think. Yet as soon as he sat down, the full weight of everything overwhelmed him once more. He opened his laptop, the cursor blinking steadily on the screen, but his focus was nowhere to be found. Every task seemed trivial in light of the truth he now carried. How could he sit here and pretend everything was fine? How could he work under a man who had shirked his responsibility, who had abandoned him and his mother so callously? The hardest part was knowing that Richard didn't even recognize him. Tyrell had noticed it in his eyes that first day, a fleeting hint of recognition, quickly brushed aside. To Richard, he was merely another worker, just another face among the many. He had no clue who Tyrell truly was, and that realization only made Tyrell's anger burn hotter. He glanced across the office at Richard's assistant, seated just outside the corner office. The door was shut, as usual, but Tyrell could easily imagine him inside, seated behind his desk, calm and composed, managing a company and hundreds of employees, while the truth of his past stayed hidden. Not for much longer, Tyrell thought darkly. He couldn't let this slide, couldn't sit idly by, knowing the truth and staying silent. But what exactly was he supposed to do? Storm into Richard's office and lay everything bare? Confront him publicly in front of the entire company? He had considered it, pictured it repeatedly in his mind. Richard's stunned expression, the truth pouring out like a torrent. But then what would happen? Richard wielded power and influence. He could easily twist the situation against Tyrell, just as he had done with his mother. Tyrell stared blankly at his screen, the words of the report merging into a haze. He couldn't act impulsively. He needed to approach this with caution. As the morning dragged on, Tyrell tried to work through the tension coiling in his shoulders, but every glance at Richard's office made his skin prickle with unease. The door stayed closed, the man inside oblivious to the storm building just beyond it. Lunchtime passed, though Tyrell hardly touched his meal. His mind was too crowded, spinning with thoughts of his next move. He couldn't remain here, not under Richard's leadership, but he couldn't simply quit without addressing him first. He needed to hear the answers. He needed Richard to admit to what he had done. But how could he make that happen? When Tyrell returned to his desk after lunch, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen. It was a message from his mother. "How are you holding up?" she had asked. Tyrell exhaled deeply, sending back a quick reply, still trying to figure it out. He didn't have the courage to tell her that he felt even worse today than he had the day before. Amara had been visibly worried when he left that morning, her eyes reflecting the same fear she had concealed for years. She didn't want him entangled in Richard's world or hurt the way she had been. But Tyrell couldn't just let it go. He couldn't simply walk away as if nothing had occurred. He needed to understand why Richard had done it, why he fired her, blacklisted her, and left them with nothing. And he needed Richard to fully grasp the consequences of his choices. The real question was how to make that happen without sacrificing everything in the process. As the afternoon wore on, Tyrell's frustration steadily grew. His work felt robotic, each task serving only as a distraction from the anger bubbling under the surface. He kept his head low, though his thoughts raced wildly within. At last, nearing the end of the day, Tyrell resolved to act. He couldn't continue simmering in silence. He needed to confront Richard directly without any games, but he couldn't do it here, in the office, where everyone could watch and where Richard still wielded all the power. Tyrell rose from his desk, his heart hammering in his chest. He needed to come up with a plan. He had to catch Richard unprepared in an environment where he didn't hold all the control, somewhere away from the office where Tyrell could speak openly. As he gathered his things, an idea started taking shape. Earlier in the day, he had overheard some senior staff discussing Richard's dinner plans. Apparently, Richard and his family frequently dined at an upscale restaurant nearby, a place where they could be noticed and where Richard could showcase his success to influential people. Tyrell's jaw clenched. This would be his opportunity. He would show up uninvited and confront Richard in front of the people who mattered to him most. He'd force him to confront the truth, to admit what he had done to Amara and to Tyrell, and he'd do it in a place where Richard couldn't hide behind the walls of his office. The plan wasn't flawless, but it was a start. It gave Tyrell a sense of direction, a way to focus the anger that had consumed him for days. He couldn't wait anymore. He couldn't let Richard continue living his lie. That evening, Tyrell sat on the subway, the overhead lights flickering as the train raced through the tunnels. His fists were balled tightly in his lap, his mind resolute about what he was going to do. Naturally, he was nervous. He had no idea how Richard would respond or if it would backfire, but he didn't care. He needed to go through with it. He couldn't let Richard escape accountability for what he had done, not without consequences. When he arrived at the restaurant, it was exactly as he had envisioned. A sophisticated venue with glass-paneled windows and warm lighting, the kind of place where people sought to be noticed. Standing outside, Tyrell scanned the patrons and spotted Richard almost instantly. Richard was seated at a table by the window with his wife, Catherine, beside him and their son, Elijah, across from them. They were laughing, relishing their evening, completely oblivious to the storm that was approaching. Tyrell's heart pounded as he entered, his mind fixated on one goal, making Richard Collins truly see him for who he was. He walked toward the table, the restaurant's ambient noise fading into a distant hum. At first, Richard didn't even notice him. He was engrossed in a conversation with his wife using animated gestures as he shared some story. But as Tyrell got closer, Richard's eyes lifted and froze. Recognition struck immediately. Richard's face stiffened, his smile vanishing as his gaze met Tyrell's. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, the tension palpable. Tyrell paused at the edge of the table, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, the moment when everything would unravel. The restaurant buzzed faintly with the hum of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of silverware and the soft lifting of glasses and toasts. It was the kind of venue where everything was polished and elegant, a place where people came to be noticed but spoke in hushed tones. Tyrell lingered near the entrance, his heart pounding as he observed the man who had once been a distant mystery, now within arm's reach. Richard Collins sat at a corner table, his back facing the window. Beside him sat his wife, Catherine, her perfectly coiffed hair gleaming under the chandelier's glow. Across from them sat their son, Elijah, exuding the polished demeanor of someone groomed for success. They laughed, completely unaware of the storm drawing near. Tyrell swallowed hard, his palms slick with sweat. This was the moment. He had envisioned this moment, but now that it had arrived, doubt began to creep in at the edges of his thoughts. His fingers twitched at his sides as he moved toward their table, each step growing heavier than the one before. Richard glanced up first, their eyes meeting across the space, and Tyrell immediately noticed it. A flicker of recognition quickly followed by the tightening of Richard's jaw. The casual smile Richard had worn moments earlier disappeared, replaced by a colder expression, one he couldn't conceal. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Tyrell's heart thudded in his chest while Richard's gaze sharpened, his posture tightening as if preparing for an impending blow. Tyrell stopped at the table, standing just a foot away, his presence overshadowing their seemingly perfect family dinner. "Tyrell," Richard said in a low tone, his eyes flicking briefly to his wife and son before returning to Tyrell. "Why are you here?" Tyrell's pulse sped up. Richard's tone lacked warmth. It was guarded and tightly controlled. He glanced at Catherine and Elijah, both of whom were now looking at him in bewilderment. "I'm here for the same reason you are, Richard," Tyrell said, his tone steady but edged with tension. "Dinner." Catherine arched an eyebrow and turned to face her husband. "Richard, is this someone from your office?" Richard cleared his throat, his expression taut. "Yes. Tyrell is one of the new employees." "A new employee?" Catherine echoed, her gaze darting between Tyrell and Richard, clearly sensing something amiss. Elijah, seated across from them, leaned forward and scrutinized Tyrell. "This doesn't feel like an ordinary work meeting. Dad, what's going on?" Tyrell's fists tightened at his sides, his chest constricting under the weight of everything unspoken. He could feel Richard's eyes drilling into him, a silent demand to step away, to retreat. But Tyrell had come too far to back down now. "I'm not here about work," Tyrell said, his voice firmer this time as he fixed his gaze on Richard. "I'm here about something else, something that occurred a long time ago." Richard's face darkened, his shoulders stiffened, and for the first time, Tyrell caught a hint of fear in his eyes. Catherine, picking up on the tension, leaned toward her husband, her brow creased in concern. "Richard," she asked softly, "what is he talking about?" Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his glass, his hands seemingly steady, though his grip was tighter than it needed to be. He took a deliberate sip of wine, his eyes remaining locked on Tyrell. "This isn't the right time or place for whatever this is, Tyrell." Tyrell paid no attention to him. His eyes flicked to Catherine, then to Elijah, before returning to Richard. "I think this is precisely the time and place." A long silence followed, stretching on like the tense moment before a dam bursts. Tyrell's voice dropped, heavy with tightly controlled anger. "You know who I am, don't you?" Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with something Tyrell couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was panic, or maybe it was anger at being trapped like this. "Tyrell," Richard said softly, his tone laced with an effort to maintain control. "We can talk about this at another time." "No," Tyrell responded, his voice rising just a bit. "We're going to talk about it now." Across from them, Elijah frowned, shooting a questioning look at his father. "Dad, what is he talking about?" Catherine placed a hand on Richard's arm, concern written across her face. "Richard, what's going on? Why is he so upset?" Richard's face remained unreadable, his eyes fixed on Tyrell, but the tension in his body betrayed him. He clearly didn't want this conversation to happen here. He didn't want the truth exposed, which only strengthened Tyrell's determination. Tyrell inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. "I'm not just another new employee at your company. I'm the son you abandoned." Catherine's eyes widened, her hand frozen in midair. "What?" Elijah's face morphed from confusion to shock, his mouth slightly agape as he looked between Tyrell and his father. Richard stayed silent, his face pale and his jaw clenched. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Tyrell stepped closer to the table, his voice trembling with tightly held anger. 24 years ago, you fired my mother, blacklisted her from the industry, left her with nothing, and then you walked away. And now I'm here, working for you, while you sit there pretending none of it ever happened." Catherine's hand shot up to cover her mouth, her eyes filled with disbelief. "Richard, is this true?" Elijah's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he glared at his father. "Dad, what's he talking about?" Richard didn't say a word. The weight of the truth lingered, impossible to ignore and too real to deny. His silence was the only response they needed. Catherine's eyes brimmed with tears, her voice shaking as she turned to Richard. "You have another child. You did this to someone and never told me." Tyrell felt the tightness in his chest ease slightly as the truth started to crack Richard's carefully built facade. He looked at Richard, his anger softening into something else, almost pity. "You ruined her life," Tyrell said, his voice quieter and more measured now. "You left us with nothing, and you think you can keep living like it never happened?" Richard's face had gone pale. He parted his lips to speak, but no words emerged. For the first time, Tyrell saw him not as the commanding CEO, but as a man trapped in the wreckage of his own deceptions. Catherine's voice cut through the heavy silence, barely audible. "Richard, how could you?" Richard finally found his voice, though it was hoarse and frail. I made a mistake. I didn't think..." "You didn't think it would come back to you," Tyrell interjected, finishing the sentence for him. "But it did." Elijah's face grew cold, his eyes blazing with anger as he glared at his father. "Dad, you really did this? You have a son you never told us about?" Richard's hand shook as he placed his glass on the table, his eyes darting between his family and Tyrell, caught in a moment he couldn't control. "I thought it was over. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Tyrell shook his head, bitterness seeping into his tone. "It's never over, Richard. You hurt my mother, you hurt me, and now you're going to face it." For a moment, silence enveloped them. The faint hum of the restaurant faded, leaving only the heavy weight of the truth suspended in the air. Catherine's tears streamed silently as her gaze remained fixed on the man she thought she knew. Elijah's hands curled into fists on the table, his knuckles whitening with fury. Richard's eyes slowly met Tyrell's again, and this time, there was no denial, only the weight of a past that had finally surfaced. The restaurant seemed colder now, the gentle glow of the chandeliers casting elongated shadows across the table. The murmurs of conversation around them persisted, oblivious to the drama playing out. But at Richard Collins's table, time itself seemed to have stopped. Catherine dabbed at her tears, her hand trembling as she rested it on the table before her. "Richard," she murmured, her voice heavy with disbelief. "You've been lying to me, to all of us for years." Richard remained still, his face ashen, staring blankly at the glass of wine before him. His once steady hands now trembled faintly. He seemed smaller now, as though the burden of his lies had finally crushed him. Elijah leaned in, his voice taut with rage. "You have another son. You ruined someone's life and thought we'd never find out." Tyrell stood at the table's edge, his chest rising and falling with a storm of emotions, anger, pain, and a touch of vindication. The truth was laid bare at last, and Richard could no longer shield himself with power or wealth. He couldn't keep pretending anymore. Richard's gaze briefly flickered to Tyrell before shifting back to his wife and son. I didn't mean to hurt you," he started, his voice rasping. I thought it was over. It was a mistake from a long time ago." "A mistake?" Tyrell's voice cut sharply through the tension. "It wasn't just a mistake. You destroyed my mother's life. You blacklisted her and left her with nothing." Catherine gasped, her hand shooting to cover her mouth. "You blacklisted her?" she asked, her voice cracking with disbelief. "Richard, how could you do something so cruel?" Richard's face twisted, the calm, controlled facade he had maintained for years shattering before his family. He tried to speak, but no words came forth. He appeared cornered, as though everything he had buried was now exposed, leaving no escape. "I had no choice," Richard finally muttered, his tone low and almost begging. "I couldn't let it come out. I had a family, a career to protect. Everything I built was at stake." Elijah shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "So you saved yourself and left them to suffer?" he said, his voice dripping with disgust. "You didn't care about them. All you cared about was your reputation." Tyrell watched the once untouchable man now appear utterly broken. Richard's hands trembled as he grasped his glass and took a slow sip of wine. His eyes seemed unfocused, as though he couldn't meet anyone's gaze. Catherine's tears streamed silently as she shook her head in disbelief. "I trusted you, Richard. I built a life with you. How could you deceive me like this? How could you do this to your own child?" The word child hung in the air, its weight pressing heavily on everyone at the table. Richard's face contorted with guilt, his eyes finally rising to meet Catherine's. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said in a feeble voice. I thought if I buried it, it would disappear, that I could shield you from it." Catherine released a bitter laugh, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "Protect me from the truth? You didn't protect anyone, Richard. All you did was protect yourself." Tyrell remained standing, his fists tightly clenched at his sides. "You thought you could simply erase us, pretend we didn't exist. But we do, Richard. We're real, and we've lived with the consequences of your choices every single day." Richard's eyes flickered with what resembled shame, but it came far too late. He had lived in comfort, building an empire, while Amara had fought to raise Tyrell on her own. There was no excuse, no reasoning that could ever make up for it. Elijah's face was set, his voice laced with disgust. "You lied to us, Dad. You created this perfect image, but it's all a lie, isn't it? How many other secrets are you hiding? How many more people have you hurt?" Richard shook his head, his voice little more than a whisper. "There's no one else, I swear. Do you expect us to believe that?" Catherine's voice broke once more, her red, tear-swollen eyes fixed on him. "After everything, you've been lying to me for over 20 years. Richard, I don't even know who you are anymore." Tyrell's heart tightened as he saw the pain etched across Catherine's face. She had been dragged into this, blind to the life her husband had abandoned. But Tyrell couldn't afford to feel pity for her, not now. She was as much a victim of Richard's deception as he and his mother. but there was still so much she didn't yet understand. "You're not the only one he hurt," Tyrell said softly, his voice carrying a chill of restrained anger. "My mother, Amara. She tried to rebuild her life after Richard fired her. She sought work, but every place she went, the doors were shut in her face. He blacklisted her, destroying her reputation. We struggled for years while he sat here living as if nothing had ever happened." Catherine's expression collapsed as the full weight of Tyrell's words hit her. She turned to Richard, her voice trembling, barely audible. "You did that to her? You destroyed her life just to protect yourself?" Richard's hands quivered as he placed his glass back on the table, his eyes brimming with guilt and regret. "I didn't know what else to do," he admitted weakly. "I was afraid." "Afraid?" Elijah scoffed, his voice growing louder. "You were scared? That's your excuse?" Tyrell felt anger rising within him again, but this time it wasn't only for himself. It was for his mother, for all the years she'd struggled, for all the sacrifices she'd made to keep them afloat. Richard's fear had robbed them of everything. "They don't get to be afraid," Tyrell said, his voice shaking with fury. "You didn't lose everything. We did." Richard glanced up at Tyrell, his eyes holding a flicker of something resembling remorse. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words empty and frail. "I'm truly sorry." But Tyrell wasn't looking for apologies. Not now. Not after all that had happened. "Sorry doesn't change a thing," Tyrell said, his tone icy. "It doesn't undo what you did. You don't get to apologize and just walk away." Richard started to speak, but Catherine interrupted, her voice trembling with rage. "Tyrell's absolutely right," she said. "You can't fix this with an apology, Richard. You lied to us and you ruined their lives." She turned toward Tyrell, her expression softening, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Tyrell. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this." Tyrell gazed at her, his anger still smoldering, but he gave a small nod. "I know this isn't your fault." Elijah, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke again, his voice heavy with disbelief. "So what now? What are we supposed to do with all this, Dad? Pretend like nothing happened?" Richard said nothing. He stared down at the table, his hands trembling, his face ashen. The man who had once seemed so invincible, so untouchable, was now just a hollow shell of who he had pretended to be. "We can't keep pretending," Catherine said softly, her voice laced with pain. "We have to confront this." Tyrell's chest grew tight as he observed Richard, the man who had inflicted so much harm, sitting silent, unable to answer for his deeds. The truth had surfaced, and now the family Richard had built on lies was collapsing around him. "I've said what I needed to say," Tyrell stated, his tone firm but frosty. "Now it's up to you to decide how you're going to handle it." Catherine's tears flowed freely, and even Elijah, whose anger had burned brightly moments ago, now seemed adrift. The enormity of Richard's betrayal had shattered their family, leaving no path back to what once was. Richard finally raised his head, his voice scarcely louder than a whisper. I'll fix this. I'll make it right." But Tyrell shook his head firmly. "You can't fix this, Richard. You can't undo what you've done." With that, Tyrell turned his back on the table, leaving them to wrestle with the weight of the truth. As he exited the restaurant, the heaviness in his chest eased ever so slightly. The confrontation had ended, and the truth was exposed, but the damage was done, and there was no way to turn back. The atmosphere at Collins Associates was different today. Conversations that were typically light and professional now carried an undercurrent of gossip. Eyes frequently glanced toward Richard Collins's office, the glass walls seeming more transparent than ever, as though the cracks in the empire he built were visible to all. Tyrell sat at his desk, observing the movement of those around him. The news had spread far quicker than he anticipated, and now the whispers had morphed into open conversations. Everyone now knew that Richard Collins, the once untouchable CEO, was no longer invincible. He gazed at the report on his desk, the words blurring together. He should have felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the man who had devastated his mother's life was finally facing consequences. Instead, a quiet emptiness settled within him. The anger that had propelled him to confront Richard now burned less intensely. Now there was only the aftermath. His phone vibrated, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his mother. "How are you holding up?" Tyrell exhaled deeply, typing back a quick response. "It's everywhere in the office now. Everyone knows." Her response arrived almost immediately. "Are you doing all right?" He paused briefly before replying. "I think so. Just trying to decide what happens next." Tyrell leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the far end of the office where Richard's door stayed shut. No one had spotted him arrive that day, and rumors were already swirling. Some speculated he was hiding at home, dodging the public eye. Others guessed he was consulting lawyers, attempting to shield himself from the storm gathering around him. None of it mattered. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. By midday, Tyrell's phone buzzed again. But this time it wasn't a message from his mother. It was an email sent to the entire company. The subject line was brief. Company announcement. His heartbeat quickened as he opened the message. "Dear team, effective immediately, Richard Collins has resigned from his position as CEO of Collins Associates. The board of directors has named an interim CEO to guide the company through this transition. We are steadfast in our commitment to our values and will continue to uphold the integrity and reputation of the organization. Thank you for your ongoing dedication during this period." Tyrell's grip on his phone tightened. It was over. Richard was gone. For a moment he sat motionless, staring at the email and letting the words settle in. The man who had once held so much power, making decisions that destroyed lives without hesitation, had finally fallen from the top. Yet, it wasn't the triumph Tyrell had envisioned. He had visualized this moment countless times, Richard's downfall, his public disgrace. But now that it had become a reality, it didn't feel as Tyrell had anticipated. There was no surge of triumph, no feeling of closure. It simply felt empty. Tyrell's phone vibrated again, interrupting his thoughts. It was another message from his mother. "I just saw the news. Are you all right with all this?" He stared at her message for a moment before responding. "Yeah, he's out, but it doesn't feel like I thought it would." This time her reply came slower, more measured. "It won't feel the way you expected, Tyrell, but you did what you had to. You confronted him. That's what matters." Tyrell shut his eyes briefly, allowing her words to sink in. She was right. He had done what needed to be done. The truth was out, and Richard was gone, but the weight of it all still pressed heavily on his chest. Later that afternoon, the office whispers had escalated into full-fledged conversations. Tyrell kept his head lowered, avoiding the curious look some of his co-workers sent his way. He didn't want to become part of the gossip. He didn't want to be the focus of attention. He just wanted to make it through the day. As the hours wore on, Tyrell realized he couldn't avoid it indefinitely. Eventually, he would need to confront the reality of what had occurred, not just to Richard, but to himself. He had spent so much time preparing for that confrontation, so much time envisioning what it would be like to make Richard Collins pay for his actions. But now that it was over, Tyrell was left with the aftermath. He was still employed at the company Richard had founded, the company that, in part, was built on lies. A light knock on his desk snapped him out of his thoughts. Tyrell glanced up to find his supervisor, Miss Robinson, standing there with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Can we talk for a moment?" she asked, her tone calm yet serious. Tyrell gave a nod, trailing her to a small conference room at the back of the office. The room was compact, its glass walls offering a view of the bustling office floor beyond. Miss Robinson shut the door behind them and crossed her arms, leaning lightly against the table. "So," she started, her tone deliberate. "I'm sure you've heard the news." Tyrell nodded, uncertain about where this discussion was headed. "Yeah, I have." She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing just a bit. I'm aware of your connection to Richard. Tyrell's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't anticipated that. You know? Miss Robinson gave a slow nod. Word travels. I don't know the full story, but people are talking. Tyrell felt a familiar tension in his chest, the fear of exposure creeping over him. What exactly are people saying? She sighed, brushing a hand through her hair. Mostly that you're his son, and that your confrontation at the restaurant wasn't exactly discreet. Tyrell's stomach sank. He hadn't considered that. The restaurant had been crowded, full of people likely as invested in the drama as in their dinners. Naturally, the word would spread. I didn't intend for this to happen, Tyrell said quietly. I just had to confront him about what he did. Miss Robinson nodded slightly, her expression easing. I understand, and I don't blame you. But you need to tread carefully, Tyrell. The company's navigating a tough period right now. With Richard stepping down, the company is going to face significant scrutiny. You're going to be under a lot of watchful eyes. Tyrell swallowed thickly, her words hitting him hard. What exactly do you mean? I mean, you'll need to figure out what you want to do, she said softly. If you stay here working in the company your father created, it'll come with its challenges. People will have questions, and they'll demand answers. Tyrell stared at her, his thoughts racing. He hadn't considered that. He had been so intent on confronting Richard, on forcing him to face the truth, that he hadn't thought about the aftermath. Staying here, remaining under the shadow of his father's legacy, wasn't just about the job anymore. You don't have to make a decision right this moment, Miss Robinson added, her tone gentler now. Just take some time to think about it. The company is shifting, and you'll need to decide if you want to be part of that transition. Tyrell gave a slow nod, her words settling heavily on his shoulders. Thank you. I'll think it over. Miss Robinson offered him a brief nod before leaving the room, allowing Tyrell to sit alone with his thoughts. By the time Tyrell exited the office that evening, the sun had already set, casting elongated shadows over the city streets. He walked at a slow pace, his thoughts weighed down by everything that had transpired. Richard was out of the picture. He had stepped aside, pushed out by the truth Tyrell had uncovered. But now, Tyrell faced a decision. Could he remain at Collins Associates, knowing the truth of the company's history? Or was it time to leave, to shed his father's shadow and carve out a new path for himself? He didn't have an answer to that question yet. All he knew was that the truth had upended everything, and now he needed to determine where he stood in the aftermath. When he arrived at his apartment, Tyrell's phone buzzed again. It was another text from his mother. Come home, we'll sort this out together. Tyrell allowed himself a faint smile, the heaviness in his chest easing just slightly. He had faced his past. Now he needed to decide what kind of future he wanted to create. Tyrell sat at the kitchen table, the comforting warmth of his mother's apartment surrounding him. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, blending with the gentle hum of the radio playing softly in the background. It was a calm, serene moment, though the weight of the past few days still hung in the air. Amara stood at the stove, her back to him as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. She hadn't spoken much since he walked through the door the previous night, and Tyrell could tell she was waiting for him to explain what had happened and what he intended to do next. He hadn't figured it out yet, but at least here, in this familiar and intimate space, the weight of the world felt lighter. Amara set the pot aside, turning to face him as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. Do you want to talk about it? Tyrell glanced up at her, unable to mask the exhaustion weighing down his body. He stepped down. Richard's out. The company has already announced it. Amara's expression softened as she took a seat across from him. I heard. It's all over the news. They're calling it a scandal. Tyrell nodded, his hands rubbing together as he searched for the right words. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would, Mom. I thought maybe I'd feel relief or satisfaction, but I don't. Amara stretched her hand across the table, resting it gently on his. That's because this isn't just about him. It's about everything we endured, and nothing he does now can change that. Tyrell's gaze dropped to her hand, noticing the worn yet resilient lines etched into her skin. She had endured so much, borne the weight of so many struggles over the years, and even now, with Richard gone, the scars persisted. "I'm not sure what to do next," Tyrell admitted softly. "Staying at the company doesn't feel right, but leaving, I don't know if that's the solution either." Amara nodded, her eyes reflecting empathy and understanding. "You don't need to figure everything out right now, Tyrell. You've already tackled the hardest part. You confronted him. You forced him to acknowledge what he did." Tyrell swallowed thickly, the memory of that confrontation still vivid in his mind. "I keep replaying all those years, all the times I asked about my dad, and you couldn't tell me the truth. And now that I finally know, it doesn't feel like it was worth it." Amara's face softened and she leaned forward, her tone gentle yet resolute. "It was worth it, Tyrell. You had the right to know the truth, and no matter how painful it was, you needed to hear it." Tyrell exhaled a shaky breath, her words settling deep within him. She was right. Even though the truth had destroyed the image of the father he had pictured, it was still his reality. And now, with everything exposed, he could finally begin to move forward. "I just don't know what to do from here," Tyrell said, his voice barely audible. Amara's grip on his hand tightened. "You're strong, Tyrell. Stronger than you realize. You faced everything and you've come out the other side. Now it's up to you to decide what comes next. You have the chance to build the life you want, free from anyone holding you back." Tyrell met her gaze, and for the first time in days he felt a small glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "You're right," he murmured softly. "I can move forward from this." Amara smiled, a small, weary smile that carried immense strength. "We both can move on." The day dragged on slowly, but it was filled with small moments of peace. Tyrell stayed at his mother's place, helping around the apartment, cooking dinner together, and exchanging stories that had nothing to do with Richard Collins. For the first time in what felt like ages, they allowed themselves to savor the simplicity of being together, free from the burden of the past. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch watching reruns of an old sitcom, Tyrell turned to Amara, the question that had been lingering in his mind all day finally rising to the surface. Do you think we'll ever get real justice for what he did?" Tyrell asked softly. Amara kept her gaze on the TV, her expression contemplative. "In a way, we already have." Tyrell frowned in confusion. "What do you mean by that?" She turned to him, her face calm but resolute. "Justice isn't always about punishment, Tyrell. Sometimes it's about survival. Richard may have ruined my career, but he didn't destroy me. I raised you. We made it through, and now we're stronger than we ever would have been if he'd stayed in our lives." Tyrell looked at her, letting the weight of her words sink in. She was right. They had survived. Despite all that Richard had done and every obstacle he'd placed in their path, they had still built a life. It hadn't been easy or fair, but they had managed to pull through. "Justice isn't just about watching him fall," Amara continued, her tone steady. "It's about us standing tall, and we're still here." Tyrell felt a lump in his throat, the swirl of emotions inside him too complicated to articulate. He had spent so much time fixated on the idea of taking Richard down, of making him pay for everything he had done. But now, sitting with his mother, he understood that the true victory was in how far they had come, despite everything. "I guess you're right," Tyrell said quietly, a faint smile forming at the corners of his lips. "We're still standing." Amara gave his hand a gentle squeeze, pride shining in her eyes. "And we always will be." The next morning, Tyrell awoke feeling lighter than he had in days. The weight of the past remained, but it didn't feel as overwhelming as before. He stood in the kitchen, brewing coffee as the soft morning light poured through the window. The world outside was calm and still, As he poured coffee for himself and his mother, his thoughts drifted to the choices that lay ahead. He could stay at Collins Associates, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized the company embodied everything he wanted to move away from. It was Richard's legacy, not his own. He needed a fresh start, to create something of his own, free from the shadow of his father's past. Amara entered the kitchen, still wrapped in her robe, and smiled as she saw him. "Morning," she greeted him, her voice gentle yet warm. "Morning," Tyrell replied, passing her a cup of coffee. They sat together at the table, the tranquil stillness of the morning wrapping around them. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They didn't need words. A peaceful understanding now existed between them, one that hadn't been there before. Finally, Tyrell spoke, breaking the silence. "I think I'm going to leave Collins Associates." Amara looked at him with an expression of calm support. "You don't have to decide that right now." "I know," Tyrell responded, taking a sip of his coffee. "But I think it's the right decision. I can't keep working there, stuck in the shadow of what he did. I need to pursue something different, something that's mine." Amara nodded, pride gleaming in her eyes. "I think that's a wise choice." Tyrell smiled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "Yeah, it really is." They lingered at the table, talking about the future and the possibilities waiting for them. For the first time in years, Tyrell felt a sense of control over his own life. The past would always remain, but it no longer had the power to define him. He had confronted his father, uncovered the truth, and now he was free to build the life he wanted, a life shaped by his choices, not Richard Collins's failures. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Tyrell glanced at his mother, his heart filled with gratitude for all they had endured together. "We made it," he murmured softly, a faint smile touching his lips. Amara smiled warmly, her eyes brimming with love and pride. "Yes, we did.